You're fine. Oh, we're voting to accept the.
Oh, sorry.
Jeff Garrison,
Aye.
Howie Goldberg.
Thank you. So just to verbalize, we have no scheduled visitors or guests, no unfinished business, no new business, but we will have a discussion concerning the proposed sign ordinance. Cameron, go ahead there, sir. I hit the wrong button.
There you go.
There we go.
Yes, staff has been working on our current sign ordinance. We anticipate bringing that back at the next meeting for action or further review. Things have occurred over the course of actually the past couple of years. Back in 2019, staff did work on an ordinance revision for off-site directional signs. That did make its way through the commission and died at the board meetings for lack of support of proceeding along with that ordinance at that time. However, in looking at considering that, we are getting some calls about the off-site directional signs, but also we're looking into the wall signs and the on-premise highway commercial freestanding signs. And then lastly, the Reed case, and we'll fill you in a little more in detail about that. Staff is getting a continual request for variances on signage. If you look around the city on our wall signs, let's just start the wall signs, but wall signs generally have been allowed on all sides of a building. But looking at the ordinance in 2006, it did identify that those wall signs can be on all street frontage and non-street frontages. On non-street, they were considered secondary wall signs. In 2009, ordinance revisions occurred and actually removed the allowance for non-street frontage wall signs. So staff has been kind of comparing with what had occurred in the past, what has actually been permitted even after that 2009 ordinance. Not really sure why that was happening, and then looking just ahead in the future and working with those developers. So staff is going back to the ordinance, reviewing that wall sign and plan to propose to allow those wall signs on all sides. If it's on the primary side, which is a street frontage, the calculation is 3 square foot allowance per linear foot of building. If it's a secondary wall sign or a non-street frontage, then it's a reduced sign size of 1 square foot per linear frontage. And that's how we've treated those in the past. Even in the past 2006 ordinance was the same way. So again, just staff is looking at a revision to those wall signs to accommodate all those sides. Staff sees no concerns with allowing those wall signs. As these examples show on AutoZone and the come and go up at Dearborn, you can are not street frontage, however, they are on those walls. The next thing that we're looking at again is the on-premise highway commercial freestanding signs. Currently, the ordinance allows these signs to be 40 foot high, and these only occur within 660 feet of the intersections of right-of-ways at Highway 65 and 14, Highway 65 and CC, Highway 65 and F Highway. So there's only just a 3 little areas of town that these are allowed. But what we're seeing is requests from the developers to increase that height of that sign. Generally, that's due to the overpass and the separation of the grade. So a lot of the requests we've seen in the past has increased that to 70 feet and 80 feet. So showing you some examples, recently the Culver sign that's not quite there yet, but it'll be built soon. It will be 70 feet, and that's just to the right of this McDonald's Come and Go sign as we have today. The Come and Go and McDonald's sign, that was an 80-foot sign, but it was a double sign. So it had Come and Go at the top and McDonald's down below. So it was a taller sign. And then we did look into the old brick Waffle House, or now it's the Billy Gales and the Brahms, and we find that they had variances requested and approved on those as well. And that's why they're taller signs. So looking back at those existing signs and what we've seen, staff is recommending to increase that 40 foot to 70 feet to maybe deter some of the future variance requests. Next is the off-premise directional signage. Some of the business owners have had difficulties with some of the customers coming to their business and finding finding the business basically and getting there. So in the 2019 ordinance, this is basically just word for word what was proposed in 2019. We are defining what an off-premise directional sign is. A monument sign erected, maintained, or used for outdoor environment that is not located on the same property as a devoted business, and for the purpose to which it is to display a message providing directional and or orientation for pedestrians and vehicular traffic to said business. We also went to further define those as being monument signs and defining what a monument sign is. These aren't to be a really tall pole sign. They're to be more of a fixed base to the ground that's kind of mimicking the overall size of that sign. And just to kind of give you some examples, this is the intent of what that monument sign might look like. Some of the features, and we are asking that they be a shared type sign so multiple businesses can occur on those. Going back to the off-premise directional sign, clarifying non-residential districts and giving the allowances of those heights. Overall height of 6 feet and overall length or width is 8 feet. Clarifying that the signs cannot be in right-of-way or easements. They've got to be outside of those, as all of our signs do. We are requiring that the property owner do provide some kind of documentation to staff that they're okay with the sign being on their property. And then these will only be allowed to occur in the ordinance where an arterial street intersects the street that is serving development. So then looking at our arterial street maps, if you can see the map in the blue and red, those are arterials, the red being the primary arterials and the blue being the secondary arterials. So if the business's road that serves that business intersects that arterial, then they are allowed to have that off-premise directional sign. To give you some examples in the past, 3 locations that we have had for these signs, one being at the senior center down here off of NN, just north of Come and Go. They were looking to put one on their property for the school to direct the traffic of the buses or the people, the parents. The senior living center up off Garden Road off of NN, just south of the ball field. They're having difficulties with some of the people coming to visit to know where to turn off of NN to get to their facility. And then up off of CC, there was a granite company that was looking at trying to put a sign up there as well. And then the last section of the ordinance is the Reed versus Town of Gilbert. And I'll turn it over to Allison, our assistant city attorney, to kind of go over some of the findings of this. Basically, there's some things that we'll need to be modifying, proposing to address a court case or a case in the system.
Perfect, thank you. Well, I'm glad I could be here to talk to you all tonight. It's nice to meet you all. So the case of Reed versus the Town of Gilbert, it's the first big case that's come up to the Supreme Court dealing with local sign regulations. So that's just important because that means that the law around sign like regulations hasn't changed really since that time. So that means that our regulation has been pretty stagnant since that regarding just how you regulate the signs in that sense and what they say and where you can put them. So the big thing from Reed, it was to summarize it briefly, it's a case, Reed was the pastor of a church and they didn't own a building, so they moved around this town and they had to put up temporary signs to tell everyone where to go because they rented event spaces and like community centers and stuff like that. And then the town was removing their signs because they said they violated their ordinance. And so their ordinance was really limiting on when they could keep their signs up. For the religious events specifically, it was 12 hours before and then an hour after the event. So the event here was the service was going to occur. And Reed sued on behalf of the church because they felt that all of the other ordinances for their town were vastly different. They had everything that ranged from political events that could be up 3 or 4 months before and multiple days after, or signs that varied in size from 80 square feet to 20, whereas theirs can only be 6 square feet. And there's no justification the city was giving them to back up those changes or those differences. And so that's why they sued, and the court found for the church. They found that Gilbert's ordinances were unconstitutional. They violated the First Amendment. And so looking at our ordinances, we have some issues that are similar to that. We have instances, where there's signs being listed as political signs, ideological signs, construction signs, things like that. And all of the ways that we regulate those are different. Some of them are just slight differences, 1 day, 2 day, or 36, 32 square feet, things like that. But based on the case of Reed, if someone sued the Ozark for enforcing that, we would likely lose based on this case. And so these, the other issue with that is broadly, they're considered content-based, is what the court called them. And they decided that those type of regulations like Gilbert had, and like we do in part of our ordinances, they don't pass constitutional muster. So strict scrutiny is the standard they have to pass. It has to be narrowly tailored to serve a compelling government interest. And so they listed off two compelling government interests in this case, which are aesthetics. So visual quality, we don't want clutter, things like that. And then traffic concerns. We don't want distracting signs or things that are going to be in the right of way to cause people, to hit each other. And so that's what they addressed as ways you can use to justify your regulations, but your regulations have to be neutral. You can regulate time, like where you can put them up and when, or on the sizes, things like that, but you can't regulate differentiating between religious signs, civic event signs, political signs, things like that. And so that's what we want to go back and look at our ordinances and say, okay, well, we've listed political signs and civic event signs. We want to pull that out and we want to make it neutral. We want to regulate, this picket sign can be here for 24 hours, or this sandwich board sign on a sidewalk. No matter what they say, they can only be here for business hours or, 24 hours before whatever we decide to do, but it needs to remove the distinctions based on what they're saying. That's the big issue that we have. And that's what I think we're going to try to address together to try to remove that in case something does come up and someone, wants to sue about these being enforced. And so that's really the big takeaway from Reed. And I think that's what we're going to try to address going forward with any changes we make. If you have any questions, you can definitely ask, but that's it in a nutshell, I believe.
In the same way, Nixa is closely working with us because they're doing the same thing. They're evaluating their ordinance in coordination with this Reed case to see what they need to modify.
So what's the possibility of, choose my words, what's the possibility of having to take each signage request on its own merits on what we say they can or cannot do? Is it going to be that specific?
I don't know if I completely understand what you're
Well,
asking.
So,
I'm struggling with my words probably.
see if I can answer that, because this is what I've got.
I gotta think of it is, basically, we have to treat all signs equally as far as a size or time frame, and it cannot be based on what they say.
The signage.
Yes, the verbiage on the sign, but we can restrict the size, the time frame,
Yeah.
but it doesn't matter if it's for someone selling property, a church event, or someone that wants to put up "I love frogs" in their yard. We just got to treat them all equally in regards to the size and the time frames.
What about, and we see it in some places up with the political thing now, like some of the signs where there's curse words on it and things like that, like political, I mean, that's a big thing where we see
Yes.
that. So some of those, obviously they don't go through the process with us, but then is that something we're considering to make sure that if, someone puts up a sign next to me that says F so-and-so, I don't want my 4-year-old seeing that,
Right. So with those, there's a lot of other issues that come up with that because you have freedom of speech.
Yep.
So there's a big Supreme Court case that says based on solely the words of
Yeah,
FU,
no, yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
just that alone won't, you can't regulate that.
okay,
The issue, the way that you could get it to be removed if it's threatening specifically someone. So if you said, that phrase to
Yeah.
maybe someone in this room that lives near you and
Yep.
is pretty likely to see it and feel threatened by it, that
Okay.
would come into assault possibly.
okay,
So they feel
I mean, I just know like on South Street, sometimes there's like a sign there and there's some things where it's not, people just put stuff up there. And that's like the sign I think of, you know, like, and that's a little bit different. It's a billboard, but they just kind of spray paint and do different things like that. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's a lot of issues in regulating that, and just based on the text alone, we're not
Okay.
really gonna be able to get them to remove that.
Yep. And then I had a different question, I guess I'll wait till you finish. So it's not the legal piece, so it's a question on the ordinance.
Anyone else? Okay.
So just for clarification, is this ordinance only applicable to permanent signs, or we're talking temporary signs like garage sale signs even, or the, what do you call it, like the yardstick kind of signs? And then my other clarifying question is there a difference if it's on city property versus your own private property?
So I'll start with some of that.
Okay.
The ordinance revisions we're talking about is both, it's permanent and temporary signs. The Reed ordinance section piece, that is generally temporary type signs. All signs are on private property. There's no signs allowed. We don't permit anything on city property,
Okay.
unless it's a city sign, of course. But if there are signs on city property, generally they have to, we'll go remove those, or they have to take those down. One thing I will add, because I know this comes up often and a lot of people don't realize this, but there are pockets in the city that are in the county. So there are a couple signs just on NN, just north of Come and Go, that are in the county. So we deal with that a lot. There's signs across from the intersection of Walmart and South Street in that pasture field. Those are all in the county, so we can't regulate any of those, but that's something we always have to keep in mind as well.
Sorry. The differentiation between temporary and permanent, the case, like this still applies. You can't, still has to be a neutral, level playing field for everybody, no matter if it's temporary or if it's permanent. But that's where that comes in, like the monument signs. We don't want maybe a neon sign or that kind of thing. You can regulate that stuff across the board, but we can't be running around telling people based on, permanent or temporary and then what it says. But just the timing, I think they have a little catchphrase with the Supreme Court that they use in cases. It's like time, place, and manner, that kind of stuff, but that's not content.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court cases wasn't so much rather they wanted to say what they wanted to say, but rather they were not given the same privilege that other signs. They were not given the same. The issue that the Supreme Court found wasn't so much that they were being discriminated.
Time frame, time limits.
Right.
Yeah, they were pointing out the differences. I have a list of them. It varied across the board. Like for ideological signs, you could have them up temporary or permanent, or just temporary, I'm sorry, for an unlimited time. There was no limit to it in their laws. And then election signs, those could be up, 4.5 months, and then 15 days after, like before and after. And then the religious sign was only 12 hours before and an hour after. And the city had no reason to justify that. And that's when the court said, you're only regulating these signs based on what they're saying, because the police have to read them to figure out if they violate each section. And then at that point, you're saying the only reason you can figure out if these violate your law is because of what they're saying. So that's where they came to, these are content-based, and the city couldn't justify them. And since they fell into that content-based category, that means strict scrutiny. And so it's nearly impossible to survive that. And they clearly couldn't. Yeah.
Same standard across all signage.
So you can't say that you can't. sorry, it's a very broad body of law dealing with the First Amendment, but we can't just broadly sweep and say no one can put up offensive words because who gets to decide what's offensive? Because what's offensive to you might be different to, Cameron or me, and we can't decide that. And there's Supreme Court cases that say that. So there's just limits to it, and we can't broadly say no offensive language because that's been found unconstitutional, because who gets to define that?
Or Jake, go ahead if you got something.
Actually, I had a question for you actually regarding that. So understanding right, I definitely see what you mean. The type of sign has to be the only reason why you limit its time frame, not what's on the sign. And if you start doing it by what's on the sign, then you get into this problem of it being a legal issue. That can you regulate the types of signs and where they go, as long as it's broad across, no matter what's on the sign. If it's this kind of sign, this is what you can do with it. This is what you can't.
We're hoping we could do when we go through and try to revise this is to say, if it's just the little picket signs, the ones you stick on the ground, this is how long they can be up. And then you have to take it down. Or, like you already can't put stuff in the right of way, that's a limit that we can put. Or I think there's ways that you could say if your event's this long, your signs can be up this long, but you can't say if it's a fair, if it's a school event, if it's a church service, that's where you can't regulate. So that's, I think, the big distinction is, again, when, where, and like how you display it.
Yeah, and so like you were saying, if it's an event sign, we could have an ordinance that addressed signs for events. As
Yeah.
long as they were all the same, didn't matter what event it was.
Yes.
As long as if you're putting up a sign for an event, this is how soon you can put it up and how soon you have to take it down.
Yes.
I got you. No problem. Thank you.
The only additional comment I was going to add is we've also been asked to look at the sign ordinance in the historic district and the C4 because they have criteria in there as well. So when we're looking at the Reed case, these other wall signs, we're trying to just coordinate the three together. So just heads up, when you see an ordinance revision, you may see three ordinances together. Yeah.
Hey, so my question, two things. Number one, I noticed with all the signs here, none of them are lit. I know just on the samples. I know in some towns they are lit, like particularly like in December, it gets dark at night, like especially like people going to the junior high for games. That would be a sign where we may want that lit. So is that something under consideration within the ordinance or?
Not necessarily in the sign ordinance. We don't address the lighting of signs necessarily in the ordinance for this. That would fall under our dark sky lighting.
Okay.
So they're either going to be internally lit or some kind of compliant lighting from the ground. I'm not quite sure how they'll do that, or something cast down on the sign, but that would fall under a different ordinance section.
Okay, and then my second question is with our mixed use ordinance that we passed, some of those buildings, if they're 3 or 4 stories tall, they like to put a sign at the top saying that the bank's here or something like that on that 4th floor.
Yep.
So when we're looking at the ordinances, there's some sort of exception for, and I'm not saying that's gonna be a 70-foot sign, but I know we said that it's just gonna be off these exits on the highway, but.
Yeah, so that would be under more of the wall sign, and that's calculated based on that length of wall, so they can put those wherever they want.
Okay, so that's
It's just-
different than this.
that's-
Okay,
yeah,
that was my
not
two
part of it.
questions.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Go ahead,
These are
Doug.
for Cameron too. not the ones that go through
Thank you.
Stan the entire time. Okay, I have 3 questions.
Yep.
That I wrote down. On the wall signs, are we gonna get specific on what can be on like all sides of the building, or are those sizes? Because in these examples, it's the name
Yeah.
of the business, which makes sense, but can they get real creative and start putting sayings? or
Definitely can. I mean, they're just allowance with the size. So say the building's 100 feet long, it's 3 square foot for that linear feet. They've got 300 square feet they can
Yeah.
utilize. They can make 5 small signs or 1 big sign, but that's how it
Okay.
is. And then if it's a building with multiple tenants, then it's kind of based on their storefront, and we break it up that way.
Mhm.
But we generally, we don't necessarily care what they put on there and utilize. The Billy Gales is a great example.
Yeah.
The one that has 14-inch pancakes or something like that on there, but yeah, no.
Okay, I could put that on there. Then has there been any consideration to doing an 80-foot allowance if it's a double sign, since we already have one of those?
We talked about that, but we decided in that case, we don't see that happening often, but if it is, then maybe we would handle it by variance if they wanted to go taller.
Okay.
Maybe we can work with them and keep them 70 feet or less, but let them do a double sign. We just haven't had any more requests for that tall of a sign since that one or before that one.
And then my last question was regarding signs on utility poles. Because I do see businesses sometimes will put their signs up on utility poles and they staple them. So I'd like to see an ordinance that addresses that.
That actually, there is, and I don't know what it says, but there is something in there that restricts that. And we
Okay.
do often, when we have time and can get to it, we'll remove those. Liberty has a little more jurisdiction over that and they take care of them. But the ones that we focus on are more the black traffic signals. Because those are city owned.
Right.
But yeah, to be honest, a lot of those will pop up and go away and they just disappeared. We
Yeah.
just can't just drive around constantly looking for these little
Right.
signs. But yeah, so that's already addressed in the ordinance. In the section.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I have one more. And I think you said this clearly. I want to make sure I understand. The business owner will be responsible for gaining permission from the private or if the owners of the private property to put the directional signs on, correct?
What we're requiring is the owner of the property to provide us a letter or documentation that they're agreeing for the sign to be built there. I suspect the applicant that needs the sign will be the one paying and building that. But at the end of the day, we don't necessarily care who the applicant is, and that's the case with most permits. It could be the owner, could be the design professional, or a friend or whatever. But yes, we just want to make sure we have documentation for our file that landowner is agreeing to have the sign.
So that has to come directly from the landowner.
Yes,
to the
some
city.
form of letter or sign off on an application or something. Yes.
Okay. Check my notes here. Anyone else signing Mitch questions? RJ, you good?
Is there any kind of provision? I didn't see anything in there, but, and I'm not saying there should be, but to limit so many monument signs per so many 100 square feet or so many, not that it would really come into play. I just didn't know if it was relevant or something to.
Yeah, I'm not sure that'll be a concern because they only can occur again, if looking at the map, at like a key location along the street. So the street separations where they bisect or tie into those arterials are going to be separated by that distance. And we are clarifying only allowing one monument sign per property, basically. And that's why we're saying you need to share that sign with other businesses if needed. But we are limiting to one monument sign on that front.
So, sorry, to piggyback, like Walmart, there's all that land behind Walmart where clearly at some point that can kind of build into more and more things. Is there something later on, or if that's the case, then we need to add a section sign, we can go back, would there be some sort of change on that, or is that?
We definitely can look at a revision later. We haven't had that issue come up. The example with Walmart, though, there is what's called a subdivision sign.
Yeah.
So at that stoplight, there is actually a sign built.
Yeah, that's.
Those are part of our regulations already in there for subdivision signs.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the area I can see a
Yeah.
bunch of stuff, or if we get a power center at some point,
Yeah.
which would be awesome.
And that's what we encourage. We encourage them to go ahead and do some type of subdivision sign for a development to take care of most of this for them.
Covered it all? Everybody good? Next on the agenda, commission comments. And I'll start with a request from Cameron or RJ on updating us on the Marabella position, whoever wants it.
Yeah, I'll start. So the Marabella was, as you know, the commission did recommend approval of the Marabella annexation zoning and preliminary plat. I lost my stuff, but anyway, the Marabella did get to the Board of Aldermen. The developer started having more concerns about the cost of infrastructure. Staff had a meeting with the developer prior to the Board of Alderman meeting to kind of clarify some details. Prior to the Board of Alderman meeting, the developer requested that be tabled until some additional research and investigations could be completed. At the evening at the Board of Alderman meeting, they tabled that to the next meeting, set a specific date of February 22nd. We got to the February 22nd meeting. The developer still wasn't ready, so he asked for that to be tabled again. In the meantime, the developer has had a non-legislative meeting with the board to discuss the project in a little more detail. Following that meeting, the city administrator was tasked with kind of outlining some potential cost shares the city could look into based on improvements that could be done to benefit the city as a whole, such as upsizing some utility lines, looping or tying in connections to have redundancy in the water system. So that's where we're at with that right now. As the city administrator was looking at researching the water connections and the facilities there. A sewer isn't much of a discussion or concern, so we didn't have a lot there. And then as far as the transportation, most of that is an agreement between the board or the Ozark Special Road District and the developer. So the city doesn't have a lot of involvement in the road other than trying to work as a partner and with what road standards are required to be developed out in that area. Internal roads would be city roads in the development, but that hasn't been part of the discussion with the developer on those. So right now it is tabled indefinitely until that developer is ready for the board to pull it back off the table. That's where it's at. Anything to?
It's no. Just no. Well, I know that's been it took a while to get it there, and then we'll just let it develop. Commission comments, anyone else? Anything, everything? If not, I guess we'll move on to administrative comments.
One thing, and I think it's at the end of your packet. Yes, the calendar. Staff has been working and some of the requests to try to get the packets out to the commission sooner. So our goal is to have those packets out a week prior to the meeting. So the Friday before, I guess 2 Fridays before the meeting, we'll try to send those out to the commission. In doing that, staff has went back and looked at our calendar for application and cutoff dates for the applicant for what staff has to complete publications, and are planning to revise and update this calendar as shown in front of you this evening. It doesn't necessarily affect anything on your end, so just want to give you a heads up. We are modifying that calendar and planning to get those packets to you further in advance.
Yeah, thank you for that.
That's all I've got.
That's all you got. Megan, the floor is yours. All right, with that being said, we would accept a motion to adjourn. I have a second. All in favor? I think we're good. Thanks, everybody.